The winter of 1941 brought more than frost to Britain's eastern countryside. It brought the constant growl of aircraft engines above the fields and the distant thud of bombs striking cities to the south. The Royal Air Force was locked in a nightly struggle to defend Britain's skies, but even as its Spitfires and Hurricanes continued to fight, another war was being fought quietly, a war of innovation, chemistry, and deception. On a small, windswept farm near the village of Ely, a local farmer named Arthur Penrose was about to alter the course of British aviation, though few outside the Ministry of Aircraft Production would ever hear his name. Penrose was not an engineer, not a scientist, and certainly not a member of the RAF. But what he created, through a mixture of curiosity and defiance, would help Britain's bombers disappear into the darkness. And it all began with paint. In early 1941, RAF Bomber Command faced a serious problem. Night operations were increasingly dangerous, not just from German flak and night fighters, but from the limitations of visibility and camouflage. Aircraft painted in the standard night black finish, introduced in 1939, proved counterproductive. Under moonlight or searchlights, the glossy black surface reflected light, making aircraft visible at long range. The Air Ministry had issued multiple circulars demanding a solution, a finish that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. At the same time, the country's paint industry was stretched thin. Factories prioritized camouflage coatings for tanks and naval vessels, leaving the RAF struggling to experiment with new surface materials. Small research teams at Farnborough and RAE, Royal Aircraft Establishment, attempted various mixtures, including matte varnishes and carbon-based pigments. But results were inconsistent. Aircraft maintenance officers began informally seeking local solutions. It was through one of these channels that Penrose entered the story. Before the war, he had been a farmer with a small side business producing agricultural paint for barns and machinery. He possessed a keen understanding of surface coatings, having spent years mixing homemade blends that resisted moisture and corrosion. When the local airfield, RAF Mildenhall, requisitioned part of his land for training grounds, Penrose often watched aircraft maintenance crews struggling with damaged finishes, repainting wings and sealing fuselage panels against the winter damp. According to later reports, Penrose overheard a ground crew complaining about reflective paint during a visit in January 1941. Out of curiosity, he asked one of the mechanics about the problem. The man mentioned that even under blackout conditions, the bombers gleamed faintly under moonlight. Penrose responded, half-jokingly, "Then perhaps you should paint them like we paint the barns." Over the following weeks, Penrose began experimenting in his workshop. His approach was unorthodox. He used agricultural lamp soot, linseed oil, and fine-ground iron oxide, combined with a stabilizing resin extracted from flaxseed. The result was a thick, uneven pigment that appeared completely matte under any light. But its real innovation lay in its microscopic structure. The mixture scattered light across multiple layers, diffusing it instead of reflecting it directly. In February, Penrose quietly offered a few buckets of the new paint to the ground crew at Mildenhall. Officially, such interference was illegal. Civilian materials were not to be applied to military aircraft without clearance from the Air Ministry. But the maintenance officer in charge, desperate for results, agreed to test it on a single Wellington bomber. The aircraft, designated R2-167, was undergoing repairs after a hard landing. Once painted, the effect was immediate and striking. Under daylight, the finish appeared dull and uneven, but under the moonlight of the airfield, the plane almost vanished. The surface absorbed light completely, leaving only the faint outline of its silhouette. The crew reported that even during taxiing operations, visibility was drastically reduced, a potential hazard on the ground, but an enormous advantage in flight. Within days, Mildenhall's station commander, Group Captain Alan Mortimer, was informed. Mortimer ordered a controlled trial. Over the course of 2 nights, R2-167 was flown alongside a standard bomber under identical lighting conditions. Observers positioned along the perimeter recorded visibility distances using binoculars and light meters. At every interval, Penrose's coated aircraft remained virtually undetectable until it was less than one-third the distance of the control aircraft. The results were compiled and forwarded to the Ministry of Aircraft Production in London. However, the report raised eyebrows. The formula's origin, an unlicensed farmer using unauthorized materials, violated wartime production protocols. The official response from the ministry's camouflage directorate was cautious, even dismissive. Unverified field tests conducted outside approved facilities are not to be used as operational data. Civilian interference in camouflage research remains prohibited, yet behind closed doors, interest was brewing. Farnborough scientists, particularly those involved in surface reflectivity research, recognized the potential of the compound. The mixture's unique scattering properties indicated a low albedo value, meaning it reflected far less light than any approved coating in RAF use. If validated, it could significantly enhance bomber survivability during night operations. Meanwhile, unaware of the bureaucratic turmoil his creation had caused, Penrose continued refining his formula. He adjusted the ratios, introducing traces of powdered carbon and silica dust to further diffuse light. Each batch was tested by spreading it over corrugated iron sheets and observing reflection under varying moon phases. The results remained consistent: total light absorption, zero glare. By March 1941, 2 additional Wellingtons from Mildenhall had been covertly painted using the Penrose mixture, now referred to informally as Farm Black. Air crews who flew the modified bombers during night raids over occupied France reported unusual results. Searchlights struggled to maintain contact, and German flak batteries reacted slower to visual sightings. While no official records mention the use of civilian paint, several operational logs from 149 Squadron include vague references to experimental night finish, markedly effective. The discovery, however, was not without controversy. When inspectors from the ministry arrived at Mildenhall in late March, they immediately confiscated remaining paint samples and reprimanded the maintenance officer for unauthorized modifications. Penrose was summoned to London for questioning under the Defence Regulations Act. He faced accusations of illegal material use and interference with government property. But instead of imprisonment, his interrogation led to something far more consequential: a classified meeting with scientists from Farnborough who demanded the full recipe for his mixture. As spring approached, Britain's war effort was entering a critical phase. The Blitz was still ravaging cities, RAF Bomber Command was expanding its operations into Germany, and the demand for better night camouflage had reached its peak. What began as a farmer's improvised blend was about to enter official military research under a new code name. Scheme D, Low Reflective Surface Coating. What Penrose did not yet realize was that his illegal formula, mixed in a barn with soot and linseed, would soon be tested across dozens of aircraft, sparking a quiet revolution in night camouflage that would remain classified for years. Arthur Penrose arrived at Farnborough under escort. What should have been a routine questioning of a civilian turned into a debriefing attended by 3 representatives from the Royal Aircraft Establishment, 1 officer from the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and 2 men who never introduced themselves, but bore the clipped, deliberate manner of intelligence officers. He was not told the meeting's purpose. The only words spoken to him during the drive from London were, "You are here to explain your formula." At Farnborough, Penrose was led into a sterile research hall filled with the smell of solvent and engine oil. Rows of aircraft panels were arranged under mounted floodlights. Technicians with clipboards moved silently between them. His paint samples, scraped from confiscated barrels, had already been applied to metal sheets alongside other experimental coatings. One of the scientists, Dr. Harold Linley, explained the situation with the detached precision of an engineer who had seen too many wartime miracles claimed and disproven. "We tested your formula last night under 4 light intensities," Linley said, gesturing toward the sheets. Your coating registered a reflective index of less than 0.08. The current RAF finish averages 0.42. In layman's terms, your paint absorbs roughly 5 times more light than anything we've been able to produce. That should be impossible. Penrose didn't know what to say. He wasn't a scientist. He'd made it in a barn using soot and linseed. But the test data didn't lie. When the sheets were placed under simulated moonlight, his mixture appeared as a featureless void. Even under bright light, the surface refused to glare. Linley motioned to another officer, who added, "Your pigment behaves oddly under infrared. Our instruments show almost no heat reflection. It's as if the surface swallows both visible and infrared light." This was crucial. The Luftwaffe had begun using infrared-assisted searchlights for their night fighters, a detail the public never knew. A paint that minimized both visible and heat reflection could make British bombers effectively invisible to the enemy for precious seconds longer. Yet bureaucracy stood in the way. The ministry officer, Edward Bryce, interrupted sharply. "We cannot adopt a civilian formula without full certification. The composition is unrecorded, production facilities non-existent, and the base materials are questionable." He flipped through the file in front of him. Lamp soot, flax resin, and farm oils. "It's a curiosity, not an industrial solution," Linley disagreed. "With refinement, it could be mass-produced." "The principle is sound. We've spent 2 years trying to achieve this level of diffusion. He did it with a barrel of soot." The meeting turned into an argument that lasted over 2 hours. Penrose sat in silence, listening to scientists debate the fate of something he'd mixed with a paint stirrer and a sense of stubborn pride. Finally, one of the quiet men, the one who had not spoken at all, leaned forward. "Mr. Penrose, if we asked you to reproduce your mixture exactly as before, could you do so under supervision?" Penrose hesitated. "Yes, but you'd have to let me use my method. I don't measure with scales, I do it by feel. If you change how it's mixed, it won't behave the same." The man nodded slowly. "Then you'll be doing it here, in controlled conditions. We'll supply what you need." That was the beginning of Project Nightfall, an unregistered program that would run parallel to official camouflage research under the ministry's codename Scheme D. Within weeks, Penrose was relocated to a small facility on the Farnborough grounds, supervised by Dr. Linley and a young chemist named Margaret Cole, one of the few women in RAE's Material Sciences division. She was responsible for analyzing the molecular structure of coatings and understood what Penrose's formula represented. Under her direction, they attempted to reproduce his results precisely. They quickly discovered why it had worked. Penrose's lamp soot contained an unusually high proportion of amorphous carbon, produced not from standard coal soot, but from the residue of burning old paraffin lamps and oil-based farm lubricants. The particles were irregular and microscopic, creating a texture that absorbed light instead of scattering it evenly. Combined with the flax resin, which hardened with a fine granular surface, the result was a near-perfect light trap. Cole wrote in her first report, "The formula's strength lies not in its chemistry, but in its imperfection. The uneven particle structure diffuses incident light across multiple surfaces, creating microscopic shadow regions. It is not a smooth finish. It is thousands of tiny valleys consuming brightness." The next challenge was scalability. Britain's chemical plants were already overburdened. Producing Penrose's paint required materials usually discarded as waste. For Linley's team, this was both a problem and an advantage. The mixture could be made cheaply, even clandestinely, using byproducts of fuel and agriculture. In mid-April, Farnborough conducted its first aircraft trial. A single Wellington bomber was divided down the middle, one half painted in the standard night black, the other with Penrose's formula. Test flights were performed under controlled illumination, with observers from ground stations and radar posts recording detection times. The difference was unmistakable. From 12 miles away, searchlights caught the standard finish almost immediately. The Penrose side remained undetected until the aircraft closed within 4 miles, a critical margin that, in combat, could mean survival. Reports were submitted under restricted classification. Officially, the formula was now RAE compound D.43, though within Farnborough it was simply called the farmer's paint. But success brought new complications. The Air Ministry was reluctant to publicly endorse a discovery that originated outside official channels. Admitting that a civilian farmer had solved a problem that eluded government scientists for years was politically unacceptable. Instead, the project was buried under layers of classification. Penrose was issued a temporary secrecy contract and forbidden from discussing his work, even with his family. He was told only that his formula would assist the national war effort. To maintain cover, he was officially listed as a consultant materials supplier for agricultural defense infrastructure, a meaningless title that concealed his involvement with the RAF. Meanwhile, experimental applications expanded. Squadrons at RAF Scampton, Waddington and Linton-on-Ouse began receiving bombers with partial or full coatings of D-43. Aircrews were instructed not to discuss the finish. Reports filtered back through coded communications, visibility markedly reduced under flare and moon conditions, enemy searchlights delayed in acquisition, flak coordination response slower than normal. Night missions over Bremen and Hamburg provided the first operational data. Of 8 aircraft coated with the Penrose formula, all returned safely. Observers recorded that several crews reported being lit up but not followed, suggesting that German night fighters had lost visual lock during engagements. The findings reached Bomber Command headquarters by the end of May, but the official report omitted the formula's true origin. Farnborough's internal documents show a quiet cover-up. Linley's memorandum dated May 29, 1941, reads, "The composition now designated D-43 derives from non-standard field experimentation initiated by personnel within Bomber Command. Civilian involvement unconfirmed. Recommend deletion of early provenance in all future documentation. Arthur Penrose's name disappeared from every subsequent file. By June, D-43 entered limited mass production under the oversight of the Royal Ordnance Factory's Coatings Division. Industrial chemists attempted to refine it for consistency, substituting manufactured carbon black for Penrose's lamp soot. The results were disappointing. Under laboratory conditions, reflectivity increased by nearly 20%. The reason, as Cole repeatedly explained, was that the factory version was too pure. The impurities, the irregular soot, the uneven granules, the residual oils, had been what made it work. She argued for one final experiment. Penrose was brought back briefly to oversee the process personally. Standing over a mixing vat the size of a tractor, he used his same hand-stirring technique, judging the mixture by texture and sheen. When the new batch dried, Linley and Cole examined it under light. Once again, it was perfect, a void swallowing every reflection. Cole wrote simply, "Replication successful under original method. Human judgment integral." The scientists realized that what the Air Ministry wanted to industrialize was, at its core, unindustrial. It relied on instinct, on the imprecision of a man who had never followed a formula in his life. By the end of that summer, dozens of bombers carried Penrose's illegal paint into the night. It reduced visibility, confused searchlights, and gave aircrews a crucial advantage during early deep penetration raids. Yet the man responsible was never acknowledged. His contribution remained buried in restricted files, known only to a handful of engineers and officers bound by secrecy oaths. Penrose returned to his farm by the autumn of 1941. He received a letter marked "Confidential, Ministry of Aircraft Production," thanking him for his contribution to material research for national defense. No payment, no recognition. Just a signature and a warning reminding him that disclosure of his work was punishable under the Official Secrets Act. He went back to tending his land, mending fences and repairing machinery. The the same hands that had mixed the paint that helped British bombers vanish over Europe. Unseen, unnamed, and uncredited, Arthur Penrose's creation, born from soot and stubbornness, would continue to coat aircraft through the remainder of the war, under names and codes he would never know. But inside the Royal Aircraft establishment, one note was scribbled in the margin of a final 1941 report. Field origin formula, non-standard process, exceptional performance. Recommend preservation under permanent classification. It would remain classified for nearly 30 years. By early 1942, the success of the D43 coating, the so-called farmer's paint, was quietly reshaping RAF night operations, though few outside Farnborough and Bomber Command headquarters understood why. The results were undeniable. Bomber losses during night raids had dropped by nearly 8% across squadrons using the coating. In official briefings, the improvement was attributed to tactical coordination and advances in radar evasion, but within the closed circles of RAE scientists, everyone knew the truth. The paint worked. It had altered the balance of visibility in the night skies over Europe. Arthur Penrose's formula, technically illegal, scientifically improbable, and officially erased from the record, was saving lives. Yet, in the corridors of Whitehall, its very existence posed a problem. The ministry could not openly credit a discovery that had originated outside military jurisdiction, nor could it risk German intelligence discovering that the RAF had developed an anti-detection coating. The entire project was buried under a new designation. Material Specification D.43/Modified Black Surface Night Application, hidden among dozens of innocuous-sounding research files. At Farnborough, Dr. Linley and Margaret Cole were ordered to transfer all field data into sanitized reports, removing Penrose's name completely. Cole protested quietly, noting in her private lab diary that, "We have stripped a man of his authorship in the name of secrecy." Linley understood her frustration, but had seen it before. In wartime Britain, invention was not individual, it was national property. Meanwhile, the next challenge emerged. As bombing operations expanded deeper into occupied Europe, the RAF required the paint to endure harsher conditions: ice, high-altitude cold, and salt corrosion during maritime patrols. The original formula, while remarkably effective at absorbing light, was fragile. It flaked under extreme cold and degraded when exposed to fuel and oil residue. To solve this, Cole and Linley began modifying the base mixture with industrial binders and synthetic resins, attempting to preserve Penrose's optical effect while improving durability. Their efforts led to a series of test failures. Each time they tried to improve the composition, reflectivity crept upward. "It's too perfect," Cole muttered during one test. "The original worked because it wasn't clean." Penrose's crude method, the soot impurities, the natural oils, even the unpredictable hand mixing, created a chaotic microtexture that scattered light unpredictably. Replicating that irregularity with machines proved nearly impossible. By April 1942, frustration gave way to pragmatism. Linley proposed a hybrid approach: mass-produce a base mixture using standard carbon pigments, then send small barrels of agricultural soot and flax resin to select airfields, where ground crews would blend it manually under supervision. The plan was unauthorized, technically illegal, but achievable. The resulting finish, coded D.43b, performed almost as well as Penrose's original. It was never perfect, but it was good enough. By midsummer, more than 100 bombers, primarily Wellingtons and Lancasters from No. 3 Group, carried the coating on their undersides and wing surfaces. The changes were subtle but measurable. During a July raid on Duisburg, radar operators reported that Luftwaffe night fighters struggled to maintain contact after visual acquisition. Pilots noticed something else. The aircraft's underside blended into the night sky so effectively that formation flying became dangerous. Crews began marking wing edges with small strips of dull red paint to avoid mid-air collisions. Still, The most dramatic confirmation came not from British observers, but from the enemy. Intercepted German intelligence reports from August 1942 included multiple references to schwarze Flugzeuge, unsichtbar unter dem Mondlicht, black aircraft, invisible under the moonlight. Luftwaffe night fighter pilots complained that British bombers now seemed to fade into the sky when searchlights struck them. In response, German air defense units began experimenting with new types of flares and ultraviolet-sensitive coatings on searchlights, a futile attempt to expose what they couldn't see. Inside the Air Ministry, the implications were both thrilling and dangerous. Success of this scale invited questions. How had such a formula emerged? Who had created it? And most importantly, could it be kept secret? A small intelligence unit known as the Scientific Liaison Section, SLS, attached to MI6, was tasked with ensuring that no leaks occurred. Every document mentioning D43, Scheme D, or Farm Black was reviewed, redacted, or destroyed. Only 7 individuals in the Ministry of Aircraft Production retained full knowledge of the paint's civilian origin. Even Linley and Cole received heavily censored memos describing their own work under new code names. Penrose, meanwhile, had vanished from the story, at least on paper. In reality, the RAE continued to rely on him in secret. When the supply of authentic lamp soot began to run low, an RAE courier visited his farm under the guise of purchasing agricultural chemicals. Penrose was asked to produce more of his unique soot, the same residue from paraffin lamps and oil burners that gave his paint its unmatched absorbency. He complied without question, believing it was for testing farm materials, never realizing that each barrel of soot he produced would soon be mixed into coatings for Lancaster bombers heading to the Ruhr. By late 1942, Farnborough had refined the formula yet again. This time, the team introduced micro-additives derived from powdered graphite, an idea suggested by Cole to stabilize the texture without altering reflectivity. The resulting mixture, designated D.43/C, was remarkable. It absorbed over 95% of visible light at oblique angles and nearly 80% of near-infrared radiation. In practical terms, it made aircraft all but invisible to the latest German Liechtenstein radar-assisted searchlights. But success carried an ironic price. As bomber losses decreased, RAF command began demanding production at scale. Factories were ordered to ramp up output, without revealing the full chemistry to subcontractors. The secrecy surrounding D.43/C bordered on obsession. Paint barrels were relabeled under civilian designations, such as anti-glare agricultural coatings, and shipped alongside normal camouflage materials. Workers who handled it were told it was an experimental moisture-resistant varnish. Only the coded stencils, property of the ministry, D.43/C, hinted at its true purpose. Through the winter of 1942 to 43, the paint continued to evolve. Cole's experiments showed that even minor contamination, a trace of ash, a drop of oil, an uneven stir, improved performance. It was as though nature itself conspired to hide these aircraft. For a time, it seemed that Britain had found an edge in the nocturnal war. Then came the setback. In February 1943, an RAF Halifax bomber coated with D.43/C crash-landed near Lille. The wreckage was largely destroyed, but fragments of the fuselage containing the special finish were recovered by German engineers. Within weeks, Luftwaffe laboratories began analysing the coating. They discovered it contained an unusually high concentration of carbon black mixed with organic binders, something far more advanced than their own matte paints. A German intelligence report, intercepted months later, warned, "The English possess a superior night camouflage compound of unknown composition. Replication attempts ongoing, the race for invisibility had begun, and the British knew they could no longer keep their secret indefinitely." Farnborough scientists responded by accelerating development. A new variant, D43/D, was prepared with modified binders resistant to reverse engineering. But the heart of the formula, the irregular soot structure Penrose had discovered by accident, remained impossible to imitate synthetically. Even with the best laboratories, no one could recreate the texture that came from a farmer's paraffin lamp. By the summer of 1943, as the bombing of Hamburg began, D-43-coated aircraft formed the vanguard of RAF night raids. Reports from German radar operators confirmed that visual acquisition times had doubled, forcing enemy crews to rely entirely on instruments. Bomber survival rates rose again. To the men who flew those missions, the black finish became more than paint. It was protection, a cloak against death. Still, few ever learned where it came from. In wartime briefings, the formula was described only as an optical innovation of the Royal Aircraft Establishment. The farmer from Ely, whose curiosity had sparked it all, remained at his fields, unaware that his soot and oil mixture had become one of Britain's quietest strategic advantages. But in the hidden archives of Farnborough, a short note appeared in a June 1943 report, handwritten by Margaret Cole. Original structure remains unmatched, source materials irreplaceable. Recommend continued acquisition from rural supplier until war's end. That rural supplier was Arthur Penrose. And even as he mended fences and fed livestock, his barrels of soot were quietly travelling under armed guard, destined not for barns, but for bombers. By autumn of 1943, the D-43 program had evolved into one of the Royal Air Force's most closely guarded technical secrets, a black project in every sense of the word. Within the corridors of the Air Ministry, the formula was referred to only as Project Smoke Vial. On paper, it appeared as a routine procurement entry under specialised coatings for atmospheric resilience, but behind the classification walls, officials knew its true impact. Bomber Command's nighttime survival rates were at their highest since the Blitz. German radar detection was being disrupted, visual tracking was failing, and even the Luftwaffe's newest night fighter tactics, the Himmelbett interception grid, were being undermined. The RAF had, quite literally, vanished into the night. Inside Farnborough's material testing division, Dr. Linley and Margaret Cole continued refining the coating's chemistry. Every test confirmed what they already knew. The formula's unpredictability was its strength. When they tried to standardize it, performance dropped. When they embraced imperfection, uneven mixes, natural soot, unfiltered resin, the aircraft practically disappeared in the dark. It was the kind of counterintuitive science that no textbook could explain, and it frustrated the ministry's industrial chemists who wanted something they could replicate on an assembly line. But there was another problem: the supply chain. Each new batch required soot from a specific kind of lamp oil, one that Penrose's farm still produced using methods dating back decades. The soot's microscopic structure was distinct, irregular carbon chains mixed with natural contaminants that enhanced light absorption. Farnborough's own carbon black lacked this chaos, as Cole called it. Without it, reflectivity increased, and the invisible aircraft became visible again. Throughout late 1943, Penrose's deliveries became vital. Small ministry trucks arrived at his farm under the cover of night, collecting sealed barrels marked fuel additives. Local inspectors were told the farmer was assisting in agricultural chemical research. In truth, every shipment was processed through a military intermediary, filtered and sent to airfields in Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire for direct use. Penrose himself never knew. He believed he was helping the government keep the crops growing. Meanwhile, at RAF Waddington, ground crews noticed the difference immediately. The new coating, rougher, uneven, and with a faint, oily sheen, performed beyond expectations. Mechanics described how the finish swallowed moonlight. At certain angles, bombers parked under hanger lamps appeared like empty silhouettes. One veteran recalled, "It looked wrong, like a hole in the light itself." Field results confirmed the visual impressions. Between October and December 1943, squadrons using D43/D coatings reported a 14% reduction in night losses, primarily due to failed visual interceptions. German night fighter crews, flying Ju-80s, equipped with Liechtenstein radar, often closed in within a few hundred meters before losing visual contact. British intelligence intercepted Luftwaffe debriefs complaining of phantom aircraft that moved without reflection. But secrecy came at a cost. As production ramped up, discrepancies appeared. Some batches worked flawlessly, others degraded after only a few missions. The problem was traced to inconsistent soot quality, a direct consequence of scaling up something that was never meant to be mass-produced. Penrose's small farm couldn't meet growing demand. Attempts to synthesize his material in factories failed. The soot produced by industrial furnaces lacked the microscopic impurities that made it effective. By early 1944, the issue reached the Air Ministry's scientific board. They convened a meeting to decide whether to standardize the formula or keep relying on Penrose's primitive process. The debate grew heated. Some argued that wartime urgency demanded full industrialization, even if it meant reduced performance. Others, including Cole, warned that losing the farmer's original soot would destroy the coating's effectiveness entirely. She had data to prove it. Reflectivity increased by as much as 20% in purified batches. A compromise was reached. Penrose's soot would remain the optical core of D43 production. To protect its origin, the ministry created a false paper trail indicating that the material came from a defunct coal dust supplier in Yorkshire. In reality, every gram still came from a handful of barns on the edge of Ely. The deception was so elaborate that even some within the RAF believed the formula had industrial roots. By spring of 1944, the stakes had risen again. The RAF's night raids were intensifying in preparation for the Allied invasion of France. The D43 coating now appeared on hundreds of bombers, Lancasters, Halifaxes, and even select Mosquitoes. At high altitudes, the effect was astonishing. German flak crews reported vanishing silhouettes, claiming British aircraft could absorb searchlight beams. Some Luftwaffe analysts speculated the British were using new radar jamming technology, not realizing the secret lay in the paint itself. In one intercepted German memo dated May 1944, an Oberst in the Reich Air Ministry wrote, "British bombers possess a surface compound that appears to negate light reflection. We have attempted duplication using industrial soot, with inferior results." Another line, underlined in red, read, "It is likely a natural material beyond our current methods." At Farnborough, Cole received the intercepted memo and smiled. "They'll never reproduce chaos," she said quietly. Linley agreed. "They can't," he replied. "Ours was born in a barn." But the war was changing. With the invasion of Normandy approaching, Bomber Command's attention shifted from strategic raids to tactical support. As the air war moved into shorter range operations, the need for extreme invisibility began to fade. The D43 coating, though still used, was gradually replaced by more conventional matte finishes, better suited for quick production. The ministry officially closed the project in late 1944, transferring the remaining stock to experimental stores at Farnborough. For Arthur Penrose, the end came without ceremony. One night, a ministry truck arrived for the last shipment. The officer handed him a sealed envelope containing a short note and a government check. The note read simply, "Your assistance has contributed to the defence of the realm. You must not speak of this matter." Penrose, as always, complied. He went back to his fields, never knowing that his soot, born from a farm lamp, had shielded hundreds of air crews from death. In the post-war years, the D43 files remained classified under the Official Secrets Act. The RAF credited no individual, and the formula itself disappeared into the archives, mislabeled as obsolete coating research. Margaret Cole continued her scientific work until the early 1950s, eventually retiring without public recognition. Dr. Linley died before the files were ever reviewed. When declassification began decades later, a single handwritten addendum surfaced in an RAE research folder dated 1946. It contained a brief summary of D43's optical properties, and one final line written in Cole's handwriting. Original absorption effect derived from civilian source. Soot structure non-reproducible by synthetic means. Recommend acknowledgement post-war if permissible. No acknowledgement ever came. Today, historians of British aviation occasionally stumble across vague references to farm black or rural coating D43, but few realise how close Britain came to losing the formula entirely. What began as a farmer's curiosity with soot and oil had altered the very physics of night warfare, turning bombers into phantoms and saving lives through a discovery that official history refused to remember. For those who flew beneath its blackened wings, it was never chemistry, it was protection, a silent shield forged in the glow of a paraffin lamp on a cold farm night.